There are people who keep waking up, working, responding, sleeping, but feel like they are not truly living. Everything happens on autopilot. Days pass, tasks are completed, and yet the sense of presence is missing. It isn't clear sadness. It's a functional emptiness. Life goes on, but it feels reduced to what is necessary to endure one more day. Billy Graham observed this state with attention. For him, when someone says, "I'm not living, I'm just surviving," this does not indicate a lack of gratitude or effort. It indicates deep exhaustion, a kind of weariness that allows a person to keep moving, but without feeling inside their own life. Living on autopilot rarely begins in a clear way. A person doesn't wake up one day deciding to disconnect from themselves. It happens gradually. First, they do what needs to be done. Then they realize they are always doing. The day passes full but without real involvement. There isn't enough pause to notice how they are, nor space to ask whether it still makes sense. The routine keeps functioning. There are schedules, commitments, responsibilities. Everything happens as it should. The problem is that inside, the person doesn't keep up with this movement. They execute, solve, respond. But they don't feel presence. They don't feel choice. Only continuity. One day leads into another without any clear difference. This way of living is often mistaken for maturity or strength. Continuing even without desire becomes a virtue. Enduring becomes normal. Complaining feels like exaggeration. So the person adapts. They learn not to expect much from the day. They learn not to ask too many questions. They learn to reduce internal expectations in order to keep going. Over time, the feeling of merely surviving settles in. There are no major, explicit pains, but there is also no engagement. Life becomes functional. What is necessary gets done. What is essential is put on hold. The person feels like they are always reacting to what comes, never truly participating in what they live. This recognition often appears in simple moments. A weekend that doesn't rest, a holiday that changes nothing, a direct question that finds no answer. Are you okay? And the only honest reply would be, I'm getting by. There is no drama in this. There is wear, a kind of wear that doesn't paralyze, but empties. The person keeps walking, but feels far from themselves. Not because they are completely lost, but because they learned to live this way in order to endure. Over time, life starts being measured by what was done, not by what was lived. The person wakes up already thinking about what needs to be solved. They complete tasks, answer demands, finish what is expected. At the end of the day, they feel relief for having finished, not satisfaction for having been present. The day ends but leaves no real marks. Days begin to resemble one another too much, not because nothing happens, but because everything is crossed without involvement. Conversations are maintained, commitments are honored, decisions are made. Still, the sense of participation is missing. It's as if life were being observed from inside a rhythm that doesn't allow stopping to feel. This experience is not accompanied by major external conflicts. On the contrary, often everything seems relatively stable. That is precisely what confuses things. The person wonders why, even with life moving forward, they feel that something essential is not happening. There is no obvious crisis, but there is an absence of presence. Getting through days demands less than living them. Getting through days requires endurance. Living requires contact. When contact becomes too heavy, the mind finds a way to continue without it. Life remains organized, but emotionally impoverished. There is no room to go deeper, only to maintain. This way of existing creates a strange sense of accelerated time. Weeks pass too quickly, months pile up without clear memory. When the person looks back, they struggle to recall specific moments. They remember the effort, not the experience. They remember the exhaustion, not the meaning. Billy Graham observed that this state did not indicate a lack of desire to live. It indicated prolonged wear. People who live this way have not given up on life. They have simply learned to move through it in the least costly way possible. Getting through days became a form of protection, a way of moving forward when being fully present seemed to require more than was possible at that moment. Gradually, living stops being something chosen and becomes something managed. The day doesn't begin with expectation. It begins with a list. What needs to be done comes before any internal question. The person learns to organize themselves so as not to fail, not to be late, not to let anything fall apart. Living turns into a sequence of well-executed duties. At this point, life is not exactly heavy. It is rigid. There is little room for improvisation, for inner listening, for noticing limits. The focus is on keeping everything functioning. When something threatens to go out of control, the reaction is to adjust, not to feel. To solve, not to stop. And so autopilot grows stronger. Living as an obligation also changes the relationship with one's own desire. Little by little, desire becomes tiring. Asking, "What do I want?" feels pointless when the day is already taken over by what needs to be done. The person doesn't stop having desires but learns to always place them second, and later almost never comes. This way of living is often praised, responsible, strong, reliable. Those who hold everything together rarely receive permission to stop, and many times they don't even ask. There is a quiet pride in managing it all. But there is also a cost that doesn't appear right away: the loss of contact with what makes life feel like more than an obligation. Billy Graham noticed that when living becomes only about fulfilling duties, something essential is pushed into the background, not by conscious choice, but by necessity. The person doesn't abandon life, they reduce it to the minimum required to keep going. This ensures survival, but weakens the feeling of being alive. In this way, obligation keeps movement going, but it does not sustain presence. The day ends completed, but not lived. And over time, this difference begins to weigh, even when everything seems to be functioning as it should. Billy Graham observed this kind of exhaustion very closely. He perceived that some people were not giving up on life, but maintaining it in the only way they had found. They remained physically present, responsible, committed, but internally they no longer felt like participants. They were merely sustaining. For him, living on autopilot was not a sign of indifference or lack of purpose. It was a sign of accumulated wear. People who spend too long solving problems, taking care of others, holding difficult situations together, learn to move forward without getting involved in order not to exhaust themselves further. Autopilot emerges as a form of protection. Billy Graham understood that when someone says they are just surviving, this is not a complaint. It is an observation. The person is not asking for fewer responsibilities. They are revealing that they lost the sense of presence while trying to handle everything. The inner life was gradually placed in the background so that the outer life could keep functioning. He also noticed that this state is rarely recognized by those who live in it. There is a normalization of constant effort. The person gets used to not feeling enthusiasm, not expecting involvement, not asking whether they are still alive on the inside. The focus becomes limited to continuing. This perspective did not come with correction or blame. It was a human recognition. No one lives on autopilot because they want to. They live that way because at some point, being fully present seemed impossible. Survival mode does not arise from disregard for life, but from the excessive demands placed upon it. In observing this, Billy Graham did not seek quick answers. He simply understood that when life is reduced to survival, it is not because there is a lack of desire to live, but because living with presence began to cost more than the person was able to pay at that moment. Living on autopilot requires a gradual distancing. It does not happen all at once. The person does not decide to disconnect from themselves. They simply begin to reduce contact. First, they ignore small signs of exhaustion. Then, they stop listening to clearer discomforts. Over time, they stop asking themselves how they are. This disconnection helps them keep going. When feeling begins to weigh too much, creating distance seems like the only possible way out. The person remains present in the right places, fulfills what needs to be done, maintains commitments. But they do so without inner involvement. It is a way of getting through the day without spending energy on what cannot be resolved right now. The problem is that this distancing does not choose what stays out. By stepping away from what hurts, the person also steps away from what engages, what excites, what gives meaning. Everything becomes flatter, not too difficult, but not truly good either, just bearable. Over time, this way of functioning becomes normal. The person no longer clearly perceives what was lost. They only feel that something is missing, without knowing exactly what it is. There is a constant sense of operating below one's own level of presence, but without the energy to change it. This disconnection is not a sign of emotional weakness. It is a sign of prolonged adaptation. At some point, reducing contact was necessary in order not to break. The body and the mind learned that being less present was safer than feeling everything. The cost appears gradually. Life goes on, but without involvement. Decisions are made, but without connection. Relationships continue, but without real exchange. The person survives well, but begins to wonder when it was that they stopped truly living. Surviving, in this context, is not a sign of weakness. It is adaptation. When life demands more than a person can sustain with presence, they find a way to keep going. They reduce internal expectations, lessen involvement, simplify feeling. The goal stops being to live well and becomes simply to endure. This adaptation is often effective. It allows the person to get through difficult periods without collapsing. They learn to do what is necessary, to expect little, to avoid getting too involved. In many moments, this saves them. It keeps work, relationships, and routine functioning. The problem arises when this survival mode extends beyond the critical period. What was temporary becomes a pattern. The person continues living as if they were still under threat, even when the context has already changed. Autopilot remains active, not because of current necessity but out of habit. Billy Graham noticed that many people remain in this state without realizing it. They are no longer in crisis, but they continue treating themselves as if they were. They avoid feeling, avoid stopping, avoid deeper contact with themselves, not because they don't want to live, but because they learned that surviving was safer. This prolonged adaptation has a silent effect. Life loses density. Everything becomes functional, organized, predictable. But involvement is missing. The sense of truly being there is absent. The person exists, but does not feel present in their own story. Surviving keeps the person in motion, but it does not place them in contact with life. And when this mode continues for too long, a difficult question emerges. At what point did continuing turn into merely enduring? There is no immediate answer. Only the perception that something needs to be reconsidered, even without yet knowing how. This way of living is also reinforced by the pace of modern life. There is little space for real presence. Demands arrive one after another, and almost everything requires an immediate response. Attention is constantly pulled outward. Solving comes before feeling. Reacting comes before noticing. In this context, living on autopilot does not seem strange. On the contrary, it seems appropriate. Those who slow down too much fall behind. Those who stop to feel risk not keeping up with what needs to be done. The person learns then to function at the minimum required level. They keep focus on what is urgent and leave everything else on hold. Over time, this continuous functioning shapes the inner world. The mind becomes accustomed to operating without pause. The body learns to keep going, even when tired. Emotions are compressed between one task and the next. There is no space for processing. Everything must fit into intervals that are too short for any depth. This rhythm does not, by itself, create the emptiness, but it sustains it. It prevents the person from noticing when something begins to slip away. There is no time to perceive the distance between what is done and what is felt. Life continues full, but barely lived. Billy Graham observed that many were not disconnected due to a lack of interest in life, but because of excessive demands. He understood that when daily life does not allow for pause, the inner world adapts by reducing presence, not as a conscious choice, but as a response to the imposed rhythm. In this way, autopilot stops being merely personal. It becomes structural. The person does not only live this way, they are taught to live this way, and while this rhythm persists, surviving seems more viable than living with presence. The cost appears later, when the person realizes they remain in motion, but do not feel truly inside their own life. Over time, the person begins to notice that they are in many places, but rarely whole in any of them. They are physically present, respond when called, participate where necessary. Still, they feel that something is always slightly distant. Experiences pass but do not settle. Conversations happen, but do not engage. The day ends without leaving a clear impression. This loss of presence is not a momentary lack of attention. It is a continuous state. The person does things almost automatically, without realizing how they reached the end of the day. There is memory of the effort, but little memory of the content. Time seems to move too fast, because nothing is lived deeply enough to leave a mark. Being on autopilot creates a strange sense of disconnection. The person knows they are there, but does not feel like a participant. They watch their own life happening, as if they were always one step behind the present moment. There is no intense suffering all the time, but there is also no real involvement. Billy Graham understood that this loss of presence did not happen through carelessness, but through defense. When being fully present becomes too heavy, the mind finds ways to protect itself by reducing contact. The person keeps living, but with less inner exposure. This prevents collapse, but it also weakens the feeling of being alive. This state often creates confusion. The person cannot explain what is missing. They only sense that something essential is not there. It is not clear sadness. It is not complete discouragement. It is an absence that is difficult to define. Life continues to happen, but it is not truly inhabited. And the longer this mode remains, the harder it becomes to return to presence. Not because it is impossible, but because autopilot becomes familiar. The person learns to exist this way, even while sensing somewhere inside that living should be more than this. Here, the rhythm slows down on purpose, not to explain better what is happening, nor to organize everything at once, only to allow the text to move forward without pressure. When life has been lived on autopilot for too long, any attempt to go deep too quickly only increases exhaustion. There are people who have tried to stop before and realized they could not stay there for long, not because they did not want to, but because feeling demanded more than what was available. So they learned to keep going. The pause in this case does not need to be long or intense. It simply needs to exist. Perhaps it is possible to notice something simple, the constant effort to continue. Not physical effort, but internal effort. The energy spent keeping everything functioning even without involvement. This effort is rarely acknowledged because it has become part of the day. But it is there, sustaining every decision, every task, every automatic response. There is no invitation to change now, nor to feel more deeply. There is only the possibility of recognizing this wear without turning it into a problem that must be solved immediately. Sometimes the first movement is not to return to living intensely. It is simply to stop demanding that everything makes sense all the time. This pause does not bring answers. It does not suddenly restore presence, but it creates something different, an interval in which the person does not need to perform strength nor justify why they are merely surviving. A moment in which continuing is already enough. When life was reduced to the essential out of necessity, expanding again takes time. Forcing this process usually creates even more distance. That is why here the pause does not ask for action, only recognition. Recognizing that surviving required a great deal, and that this cost needs, at the very least, to be seen. There is a rarely spoken fear behind life on autopilot, the fear of stopping and feeling. Not because feeling is bad, but because stopping may reveal things that were set aside for a long time. When a person lives only at the level of necessity, they avoid coming into contact with everything that was left behind in order to keep going. This fear rarely appears as a clear thought. It shows itself as urgency, as the need to always be busy, as difficulty in doing nothing. Stopping feels dangerous not because of emptiness, but because of what might emerge when the rhythm slows down. Old feelings, accumulated frustrations, questions that never had space. Billy Graham observed that many people kept autopilot active precisely to avoid touching this content. He understood that for those who spent a long time surviving, feeling again can seem risky. The mind learned that maintaining distance was safer than getting involved. This fear is not a sign of weakness, it is the result of experience. At some point, feeling too much came at a high cost, so the person learned not to feel as much. They learned to function, to fulfill duties, to keep going. Autopilot did not appear by chance. It was built as protection. The problem arises when this fear continues operating, even when the threat is no longer the same. Life changes, circumstances change, but the inner world remains in defense mode. The person continues avoiding stopping, even while sensing that living this way is no longer enough. Stopping and feeling are not simple when someone has spent a long time avoiding them. It requires energy, time, and a minimum sense of inner safety. While that safety does not exist, autopilot seems like the only viable option, not because it is good, but because it is familiar. And so, the person keeps surviving, not because of a lack of desire to live, but because of fear of what they might encounter when they finally allow the movement to slow down. Over time, surviving stops being just a phase and starts functioning as a protective system. The person no longer lives this way only because they need to, but because they learned that this mode prevents greater wear. Keeping everything basic, predictable, controllable, feels safer than exposing oneself to emotions that have been stored away for too long. At this point, autopilot is not laziness or a lack of interest in life. It is containment. The person limits involvement to avoid coming into contact with what they still do not know how to handle. They reduce expectations, lessen desire, adjust dreams to fit the minimum necessary. All of this helps them keep going, but it impoverishes the experience of living. Billy Graham understood that this kind of prolonged survival is born from the need for self-preservation. He saw that many people did not stop living because they wanted to, but because living fully seemed to require more than they had at that moment. Surviving was the way found not to break. The problem is that this protection begins to demand a high price. Life remains stable, but without involvement. Choices are made without conviction. Relationships continue, but without deep exchange. The person is safe but distant, protected but disconnected. This way of living creates a difficult paradox. The more the person protects themselves, the less alive they feel. And the less alive they feel, the more they feel the need to protect themselves. Autopilot sustains itself, even when it no longer fulfills its original function. Recognizing this does not mean abandoning protection immediately. It simply means realizing that surviving was important, but it may not need to be permanent. Life does not return all at once. Presence does not come back by decision, but understanding that autopilot was a defense and not a failure changes the way this state is seen, and that, in itself, already shifts something inside. After observing all of this, there is no clear ending point. The feeling of merely surviving does not disappear because it has been recognized. It may remain for some time. What changes is the way this experience is understood. It stops being seen as personal failure and becomes understood as the result of a long period of adaptation. There are people who have lived this way for so long that they no longer know when it began. Surviving became routine. Living with presence feels distant, almost abstract. Not because it is impossible, but because it was placed on hold out of necessity. Life demanded endurance, not involvement. Billy Graham used to observe these states without haste to resolve them. He understood that some human experiences do not ask for immediate solutions, but for honesty. Honesty to recognize that there was excess, that there was exhaustion, that there were moments when continuing was all that could be done. This recognition does not immediately restore life, but it changes the starting point. The person stops blaming themselves for not living intensely and begins to realize that surviving required far more strength than it appears. And that deserves to be acknowledged. Perhaps truly living does not begin with major changes, nor with clear decisions. Perhaps it begins with something smaller, stopping treating survival as failure, accepting that this mode was necessary, and allowing little by little for presence to find space again, without haste and without demand. Nothing needs to be resolved right now. Life does not need to be fully felt today. It is enough to recognize that surviving was not insignificant. It was what was possible, and that this possible can, over time, open space for something more. If you feel that you have been living mostly on autopilot, that your days are being endured more than truly lived, I suggest that you subscribe to the channel. This space was created for those who need to return to presence gradually, without pressure and without easy promises. Here, the reflections help explain why surviving became necessary and how this way of living affects the inner life over time. By subscribing, you gain continuity, content that accompanies this process with calm, clarity, and depth, inspired by the way Billy Graham observed the human being in their most common and least spoken conflicts. And if you wish, the comments are open for those who feel the need to put into words something that usually remains unspoken. Sometimes that alone is already a beginning.